The war camp of the Dragonfire Alliance smelled of ash, iron, and something far older, the deep musk of scaled creatures who had walked this world long before the first human ever drew breath. 40,000 soldiers had gathered beneath the crimson banners of Queen Seraphyx, the dragon queen whose wingspan alone could shadow an entire battlefield. Generals from 7 species sat in her war council. Elven commanders, dwarven siege masters, orc warlords, all of them ancient powers, all of them proud. And somewhere near the back of the camp, elbow deep in a pile of draconic plate armor worth more than most kingdoms, sat Ethan Cross. He had grease on his cheek, coffee going cold beside his toolbox, and absolutely zero business being here. It had started 3 days ago when the Alliance's chief armorsmith, a dwarf named Grundok the Unmatched, had broken 4 fingers on his right hand during a supply wagon accident. His apprentices were competent for standard work, but Queen Seraphyx's ceremonial warplate was not standard work. It was ancient draconic alloy, forged in volcanic chambers 2,000 years ago, layered with enchantments, and currently in 3 separate pieces after a failed assassination attempt had put a trollbone lance clean through the left pauldron. The coronation battle was in 4 days. The queen needed her armor. The armor needed someone who could think differently. Ethan had been attached to the Alliance as a human technical liaison, a polite title for the guy who fixes things when magic and tradition both fail. Back on Earth he'd been an aerospace engineer. Here, he was mostly treated like a slightly useful pet. He'd asked to look at the armor. They'd laughed. Then Grundok had looked at his broken hand, looked at the armor, looked at his useless apprentices, and said, "Fine. If the human breaks it worse, at least we'll know." Ethan didn't break it worse. He spent the first 6 hours just studying it, not touching, just looking. Running his fingers millimeters above the surface, mapping stress fractures with a small UV lamp he'd packed in his kit. The enchantments were incredible, layered like composite materials, each one serving a structural purpose the ancient smiths had understood intuitively even if they'd never written an equation for it. The lance had shattered the left pauldron's outer shell, but the real damage was internal, microfractures radiating through the shoulder joint assembly like cracks through tempered glass. The dwarven apprentices had tried to weld it. That was the wrong move entirely. Ethan pulled out his notebook. The draconic alloy behaved, under heat stress, almost exactly like a titanium ceramic matrix composite. The enchantment layers acted as piezoelectric membranes, pressure applied to the outside translated into distributed force across the whole surface, which was how the armor absorbed dragonfire and warhammer blows alike. Welding had disrupted 3 of those membranes. The apprentices hadn't known. How could they? They thought of it as magic. Ethan thought of it as engineering. He sent a runner for copper thread wire, a specific ratio of volcanic sand to river clay, and something that made every dwarf in earshot stare at him, a set of precision files from his personal kit, measured to tolerances they didn't have a unit of measurement for. Then he got to work. By the morning of the 4th day, Ethan Cross had slept roughly 6 hours total. He'd eaten when someone remembered to bring him food. He'd spoken to no one except to request materials, and once to politely ask a dwarven apprentice named Breck to hold a component right there. Yes, don't move, don't breathe, actually, can you breathe a little less? When he finally set down his tools and straightened his back with a sound like cracking firewood, the armor sat whole on its stand. Not just repaired. Better. He'd retensioned the enchantment membranes while he had access to the internals, correcting a 200-year-old misalignment in the right vambrace that had been slowly degrading its heat resistance. He'd reinforced the lance strike point with a microlattice of copper thread that would distribute any future impact across a wider surface area. He'd buffed out the scoring on the breastplate and reseated the dragon scale inlays that had been loose since before the assassination attempt. He could tell by the wear pattern in the channels. Breck the apprentice stood behind him, staring. "She's going to want to know who did this," he said quietly. Ethan picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Probably. Queen Seraphyx did not enter a room. She arrived in one. The war-tense entrance seemed to shrink as she ducked through it, her true form only partially suppressed, 7 feet of scaled, golden-eyed power, with horns that curved back like a crown and a tail that moved with slow, deliberate authority. Her generals filed in behind her. Every species of soldier and commander in the alliance seemed to have found a reason to be nearby. She stopped in front of her armor. Silence. She circled it once. Then again. Her claw, each finger the length of a human forearm, reached out and touched the repaired pauldron. Her eyes narrowed. She tested the joint. Rolled the shoulder assembly through its full range of motion. Looked at the breastplate. Looked at the vambrace. When she spoke, her voice was the sound of stone sliding over stone, low and resonant enough that Ethan felt it in his chest. Who repaired my armor? Grundok was present, his bandaged hand held at his side. He said nothing. The dwarven apprentices said nothing. Ethan Cross set down his toolbox, wiped his hands on his work cloth, and stepped forward. I did, Your Majesty. Every head in the tent turned. The Dragon Queen turned last, slowly, and looked at him with those vertical pupil golden eyes that had reportedly unmanned kings and broken enemy generals before a single scale had been bloodied. Ethan met her gaze. He wasn't particularly brave. He was just tired and slightly irritated and running on bad coffee, and in his experience, the most dangerous moment had always been while the work was still uncertain, not after it was done. You are human, she said. It was not a question. It was barely even an observation. It was closer to disbelief. Yes, ma'am. You are the technical liaison. Again, not a question. He suspected she'd done her research in the 6 seconds since he'd stepped forward. Dragons were thorough. Yes, ma'am. She turned back to the armor. Her tail moved, a slow, considered sweep that Ethan had learned in his 3 months with the Alliance was the draconic equivalent of a raised eyebrow. The right vambrace, she said. Misaligned enchantment membrane. Probably since the last major repair, I'd estimate 2 centuries ago. It was degrading your heat resistance by about 15% on that side. I corrected it. Silence. The shoulder joint. Copper thread microlattice. Distributes impact force. The lance that hit you took advantage of a stress concentration point in the original design, good design for its era, but materials science has moved on. It won't happen the same way again. More silence. The Dragon Queen's generals were exchanging glances that ranged from confused to deeply uncomfortable. Seraphyx turned back to him. Those golden eyes moved over him with the same slow, systematic attention she'd given the armor. He felt, briefly, like a component being assessed. Why? She asked. It was a strange question. He considered it. Because it needed doing, he said. And I could do it. She was quiet for a long moment. My armorsmiths have served this court for 6 generations, she said. They know this armor as they know their own hands. They did not attempt what you have done. They know it as tradition, Ethan said, carefully. I looked at it as a problem. Different starting point. Another silence. Then, and Ethan Cross would later describe this as one of the most unsettling experiences of his life, Queen Seraphyx smiled. It involved a great many very large teeth. Human, she said, you will ride in my vanguard tomorrow. Grundok made a noise that might have been a protest. The Dragon Queen's tail moved once, and he stopped. Your tools, she continued, eyes still on Ethan. Your methods. Your different starting point. These are weapons I have not fielded before. She tilted her head, just slightly. I find I am curious what else you can fix. Ethan Cross looked at the armor he'd spent 3 sleepless days repairing, at the Dragon Queen who ruled 40,000 soldiers, at the assembled generals of 7 species all staring at a human with grease on his cheek and a cold cup of coffee. He picked up his toolbox. You're going to need to show me your siege equipment, he said. I had some thoughts about your catapult calibration. Seraphyx laughed, a low, thunderous sound that rattled the tent poles. Come, then, mechanic. And Ethan Cross, aerospace engineer, technical liaison, and apparently now royal armorsmith to the Dragon Queen, followed her out into the morning light. Behind him, Breck the dwarven apprentice turned to his colleague and whispered, "Did that just happen?" His colleague watched the tent flap settle. "Humans," he said, with a reverence that tasted almost like fear. "They won the coronation battle in 4 hours." Historians would later argue about tactics and troop positioning and the role of the eastern flanking maneuver. The armor did not take a single breach. And somewhere in the vanguard, a human mechanic was already taking mental notes on 3 different ways to improve the Alliance's field fortifications. Nobody laughed at him anymore. //